Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm Ariqah and today I'm going to explain about Edwardian era. Okay, now I'm going to explain about the characteristic of the era. To some nostalgic observers, the short of reign of King Edward VII seemed like an autumnal idyll, an era of international peace, internal security, and relative prosperity. It was a period ushered in by the conclusion of the South African War in 1902 and by consolidation of Britain's imperial possessions. To some, it seemed to have symbolically closed, not with the end of the king's reign, but with the death of Captain Scott and his party in the Antarctic, that having failed to reach the South Pole before the better organized Norwegian Amundsen. King Edward might have been happy with the popularly bestowed title of the peacemaker, and even happier with the pomp and circumstance of state visits and intimate and avuncular chats with his numerous close relatives among the ruling dynasties of Europe. But in Britain, at least, policies were made by cabinets, not kings, and the drift of history was far from being in Britain's control. Despite the reality of its international prestige and power, Britain's economic and military success was now relative. Perhaps the most urgent political question of the Edwardian years was that of women's suffrage. The Women's Social and Political Union was formed in 1903, and between 1906 and 1914, the union undertook increasingly militant action to further its cause. Though largely respectable and middle class in inspiration, the suffragette movement was the first truly galvanizing force in the lives of a wide spectrum of British women, for, as one activist later put in, it provided our education in that living in identification of the self and with the corporate whole. The Representation of the People Act became law in February 1918, giving the vote to women over age of 30. That the age qualification was reduced to 21 in 1926. In the election of 1906, some 19 candidates supported by the LRC gained parliamentary seats and the new Labour Party emerged, initially providing vital support for the social reforms embarked on by the governing Liberal Party. The crisis was only resolved by the Liberal election victory in 1910 and by the introduction of the Parliament Act, which effectively deprived the upper house of all the power over money bills and limited its subsequent influence over all other legislation. The golden age of King Edward's reign was not always an illusion, but it was certainly a reality for the relatively privileged. In some significant ways, the early years of the 20th century were marked by a triumphant Englishness, or the very least by confident swagger and independence of English architecture and English music. It was also the age of the garden city and the experiment with urban, suburban, and rural planning, which have profoundly affected both how the English look at themselves and how the foreigners look at the English. Now we are moving to the characteristic of the works and the famous works in Edwardian era. The first characteristic of the work is novel. In the mainstream English fiction of the early 90s, the religious dub of the preceding 20 years and the reaction against Victorian repression and the social or familial oppression are gradually marginalized. Pervasive desire to articulate the unsaid and to give voice to formerly silent social groups, to women above all, and also to the often conventional, generally ignored petty bourgeois. The common man and woman bravely moved to the center stage before being ushered off again according to the elitist taste of the modernist. It looked to formal experiment, to verbal pyrotechnics, to synchronic play, and to the extraordinary in character and expression, more traditional writers. There are several works and several authors that I take for this era. The first one is Herbert George Wells. His works are the first one is The New Machiavelli. There were hordes of men in the modern industrial world who had raised themselves up from the general mass of untrained, uncultured poor people in a hard industrial selfish struggle. The second one is Anne Veronica. The book is forthright in its discussion of marriage and of women's rights, describing very much from the male's perspective. It contains sobs for the supporters of women's suffrage, forcibly stating a case for the ceasing of this coddling and browbeating of women, and for the free and fearless participation of women in the collective purpose of mankind. Here, Wells also famous with his science fiction novel that are The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, and The War of the World. Wells is one of the new English writers to be well-read in modern science and in the scientific method. He was also ambiguously persuaded both of the advantages of a socialistically and scientifically planned future and of the inherently anti-humanist bent of certain aspects of scientific progress. The second one is Arnold Bennett. His work is The Old Wives' Tale, traces the divergent fortunes of the two sisters from the middle to the late 19th century against the backgrounds of a slowly, unwillingly changing English industrial town and the turbulent Paris of the 1860s and 1870s. The small and provincial are counterbalanced by the metropolitan and the sophisticated, and the generations conflict, converge, divide, and die. The Old Wives' Tale suggests a usefully detached perspective on his own birthplace, and the real focus of his fiction, the five drab towns of the Staffordshire potteries. Bennett intrinsically relates his characters to the shaping topography, geography, class, and culture that surrounds them, but he always brings them back to acquired habit, the partiality, and to plot. The next author is Mary Sinclair. Her works is Mary Olivier, A Life, a novel which traces the expanding consciousness of middle-class girl, the youngest girl in a family of boys. Mary Olivier deals subtly with the parent-child relationship, and especially with a daughter's strained love for her clinging, intellectually limited mother. It also movingly describes the slowly burgeoning career and the reputation of a woman writer in literary London in the early years of the century. The next characteristic of work is poetry. The poetry of 1880s and 1890s was dominated by the later work of those poets whose reputation had been made some 30 or 40 years earlier. The prolific, if sometimes impenetrable, later verse of Browning and Tennyson continued to flow until their respective deaths in 1889 and 1892. On Tennyson's death, Queen Victoria, seeking advice on whom to appoint as the new poet laureate, was informed that Swinburne was the best living poet in her dominus. The verse of the younger generation of poets was of a distinctly diverse kind, ranging from the often raucous balladry of Kipling to the vivid, adjectival experiments of French-inspired decadence and the poised lyricism of the Rhymers Club. Okay, now I'm going to discuss about the famous work of poetry. The first author is Alfred Edward Housman. Throughout Housman's work, there is also a poignant sense of loss and lost illusion, the mood most famously caught in the lyric 40 of a Shropshire Lad. Most of Housman's poetry is closely related to the firm and the often tragic or elegiac mood of the traditional ballad. Housman himself maintained that he was also working under the influence of Shakespeare and of the folkslied poetry of Heinrich Heine. The second author is Charlotte Mew. Her work is The Yellow Book, deal with defeat with unrequited but not always sexual love. Her 2 volumes of verse, which appeared in 1916 and 1929, suggests a new variety of perception and expression, much of it self-consciously impressionistic. The third author is Thomas Hardy, and his work is Jude the Obscure. Hardy gave the impression of embarking on a new career as a prolific poet. His first volume appeared in 1898. That is his last in the year before his death. The agnosticism which so marked his novels takes on a new shaping power in the poetry. But the awkwardness, the strain, the conflicting perception and the arguments and the plethora of the information in the late fiction are all controlled and disciplined within the succinct and variant verse from that Hardy evolved. After reading through this era, I can learn a lot from it actually. And before closing my explanation, I will give my conclusion about this era. That I can learn from this era that the era shows there are lots of movement that keep growing in this era. We can see it from every aspect of the society, especially from the works. The works contain of the messages to give the consciousness to others about the rights as a human being, so that people will have their equality among others. I think that's the main lesson that I can take from this era, and I hope you all enjoy my explanation, and I am so sorry for any mistakes from my explanation. And for the last, I say thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Have a great day.